BSides DC 2017 videos are brought to you by Threat Quotient, introducing the industry's first threat intelligence platform designed to enable threat operations and management, and Data Tribe, a new kind of startup studio co-building the next generation of commercial cybersecurity, analytics, and big data product companies.
So I submitted my talk originally. It's supposed to be a case study on hacking ASUS routers, specifically from the application layer. There were many other people chosen in front of me, and I was chosen as a backup speaker, and now you know why.
I can work on this if you want to go ahead and get started. I'll get your slides up.
Okay, thank you.
While you're going.
Okay, so my talk is about, I'm an application security engineer. My background is a software developer. I don't mess with routers on a regular basis or on an unregular basis. And what I do is I do security on application layer. That means Java apps, web apps, Node.js apps. We don't descend below level 7. However, I happen to have a router, and I got curious about what's actually inside the router. And firmware is kind of one of the things I never had a chance to look into. So I spent one night unpacking the firmware and just started looking into it. And what I found in there is actually, I got 5 CVEs of how to actually hack into the router, but all of them are still on application layer. There's nothing on the network layer. So again, my talk was really about, thank you, is about even things that we don't, from the application layer, we don't expect those things to be in routers, but they're there anyway. So I'm a software developer. I work for a big financial institution who wishes to remain unnamed. You could Google it. And I have some background in around anti-spam piping. So if you know what SPF is and DKIM, I was involved in those things many years ago. I also wrote the RFC for comma-separated value files, if you use those. I'm going to talk about exploitations. And this is my standard warning. Don't hack your friends. Ask permission. Now, there's 2 parts to this talk. First, I'm just going to run through the process, my thought process of what I went through. And then I want to show you what exactly that it was that I found. So I'm not a pen tester. I'm a developer. I'm the guy that pen testers hate because I install stuff on my computer that you don't want to see. What happens is that I never dealt with firmware. I know hypothetically what firmware is. I know what a router is. I know what it's running. But I never actually looked into it. So I have an ASUS router, and over the years, I was curious what's inside the router. So if you know anything about ASUS, they're not exactly very regular with their updates. So when they did come up with an update, I was kind of trying to figure out, is there a way for me to kind of crack it open and see what's inside? Now, for those of you who work with routers all day, it's probably a no-brainer. But for me, coming as a software developer way, way up in the stack, the router to me is a box. It's a box you stick on a network and you let it do its own thing. So what was curious to me, what basically is the point of my talk, is I started from the application layer and I ended up in the application layer, even though it was a router. Now, this is what I did. It basically took about a night. I downloaded the firmware, I opened the firmware, I found a file. What in the world is a file? It turns out it was some sort of a Linux partition. And again, I'm just going on blindly. I'm opening the files. I'm looking into them. So I open the file. Now, one thing I do know is that routers do not run Windows. And if you have a router that's running Windows, you probably shouldn't be having it. Inside the router, there are JSON files and there are ASP files. Now, ASP files are .NET IIS files. They do not belong in routers. So obviously, there's something's funny. So this was essentially the command flow, is that I took the file, I downloaded binwalk, I opened it up, never used binwalk before, and here's what I found. Now, I'm not interested from my point of view into looking into the C source and the command and the Linux configurations in there. That's not what my expertise is in. So what I was looking for is just curious, just see what's in there. So I see these ASP files. Now, in the application security world, an ASP file is a Windows IIS script. Obviously, that's not what the router is supposed to have. But when I went in and inside these files, it's actually turned out to be HTML and JavaScript. For whatever reason, ASUS decided to package their web UI files as ASPs. There's some sort of an engine that interprets them. I don't know what that engine is. I didn't dig into it. But what I did see is I saw JSON code. Now, once I dug into all the way down, what I saw was JSONP. Now, JSONP, for those who are not familiar, is that the browser security model prohibits us from loading JavaScript files across domains. JSONP is a way to kind of bypass that. And if you tell the server, here's my callback function in JavaScript, and give me the JSON, what it does is it doesn't just return the JSON file to you, it also wraps it around and executes it in the callback function you provide. What happens is that to bypass the security model, instead of using the standard ways you load it, you would do is a simple script include. You do script include, you pass it to your server, it loads your JSON. Now, a router is not a place where you want to find JSONP. And in the second part, I'm going to actually show you what that looked like. But essentially, what that means is you can do calls into the web UI of the router, and you can get stuff back. This is an example of what one of the files looked like. Again, I don't know what the engine is. I didn't dig enough into it. It must be something Linuxy. What it is exactly, I don't know. But what you do see is it's kind of like it's putting some data into it. Now, at that point, what I have is I have the router that's working with the UI, and I have my source code. And the names start to match. Some names match, some names don't match. So I'm not in the router world anymore. Now I'm back to where I started, where my expertise lies, which is application security. Now, when I'm looking at the router, I'm no longer looking at it as a box. I'm looking at it as somebody wrote a UI, they have a web application, which is insecure. It happens to be running in the router versus a conventional computer. But that's what I'm looking at. So I started looking at it. Now, at this point is I'm not thinking in terms of ports. I'm not thinking in terms of what services are running on the router. I'm looking from a point of view of an application security engineer. And what we're looking for is this is a web UI. There are common things that are described in the OS Top 10 that web UIs have. They're vulnerable. Those are some of the things you can start with. But basically just start looking around as if treating it not as a router, but as any other application. What I started looking at is there was no specialized tool. I did not use Burp. I loaded up Chrome. I put up the developer tools in Chrome, and I just started going through the router UI. And if the firmware is bad, from what I hear, the UI apparently was even worse. The quality of the code, that at least I saw the JavaScript was, from a security angle, was pretty bad. So at this point, over a couple of days, so I found one, I found two, found three, I found four. Eventually, there were 5 different CVEs. If you follow the entire chain all the way to its end, you can take over anybody's router. Now, there is a very big difference in web security and application security, how you take things off, okay, how you take something over, versus network level. And in part 2, I'm going to go through it. Now, at this point, so I just spent a couple nights looking at a router. I've got a bunch of issues. Now, what am I supposed to do with it? If I was a black hat hacker, I know what I'm supposed to do with it. Now, luckily for ASUS, I'm not. I contacted ASUS. Now, ASUS took a while. I always go through CERT. For those of you who've dealt with responsible disclosure, it's kind of, CERT isn't always helpful, but if the vendor decides to go back after you, at least you have a second independent party that was involved. Eventually, they fixed it. One of them we still have a disagreement on. They don't want to fix it. I think it's an issue. They don't think it's an issue. And I'll show you what the issue looks like. It took them about a month to fix it. I waited an extra month afterwards to actually disclose it. The funny thing happened is once it was disclosed, and again, I don't know why this issue over any other issue, the media suddenly picked it up. I reported an issue in a single router model. Based on what the users started sending to me, somewhere between 40 to 50 different ASUS models are affected. I think pretty much every single one. ASUS officially only released patches for specific ones, but as sort of these other things start coming out of the woodwork, they started fixing the rest of them. The last issue is being worked on. As far as I know, at least for the router that I worked on, which is the RT-N56, they do not have a fix. However, they do have a fix for everything else. So bottom line is that for me as an application security engineer, it's good to be curious. Even though I don't touch network level stuff, in this case, it was a good thing. And a lot of times we have silos that we work in specific areas. We don't necessarily always follow things. Now, what I want to look at this point is when I actually go through the 7 vulnerabilities. An interesting thing about ASUS. ASUS is actually under a legal consent decree because their routers are not secure. And I believe D-Link is going through the same issue. The Federal Trade Commission is slowly going through all the various router vendors and suing them to force them to do security. That is, I think, one of the reasons why ASUS responded so fast, because my experience with other vendors, even Google, has not been that fast. There's 42 models, everything that's RT dash. Since I wrote the slide, I think the number crept up a little bit because some of the routers, RT is the retail model. There's also the 4G models. There's a couple of other variations. Everything prior to 2017 is affected. There's at least 2 open source projects that derive from the ASUS firmware. I think one is the ASUS WRT, one is the Merlin project. If they copy code from ASUS, and ASUS is very good about GPL disclosure, then they are probably affected. I did not test them. To give you a scale in terms of sort of the rest of the internet, their market share, at least according to what the industry people are saying, is 4.3% in last year. For the high-end Wi-Fi routers, basically anything over $100, their router share is much more, it's like 13%. Now, very important point is the last one. This is not network level. That means you cannot just go into Shodan or Census or anything like that and start scanning every single IP. You will not find these issues. Because this is a web security issue, not a network security issue, the exploitation path is different. In some ways it's easier, but in some ways it's much harder. So it's not something you could just pop open from a port. So these are the CVEs that I found. There essentially are 4 of them. MITRE, when they assigned them, I think they originally, I asked for 2, they assigned 4, there's a 5th one. So these are basically our 4. And what these 4 are as follows. The first one is the one that's the worst. That is known as a CSRF. Now, a CSRF attack relies on the fact that you don't have state in the browser. When the browser talks to the website, there's no state. So there's various tricks that we do to establish state. The most common is a cookie. But essentially is if you're logged into bankofamerica.com, any other website can start posting stuff to the same domain because the browser will just take the cookie and send it over. Now, that is not something you want to see in the router because if you do have a CSRF issue in your router, that means you can actually do a post to the router UI from any other site and change things. The next 2 are somewhat less of an issue. If you do have connectivity to the router, then I mentioned earlier there's a callback. You could do a callback from any other website. Remember, there's no web security at this point because the people that wrote the UI chose to bypass it by putting in JSON-P. You could call the router and you get stuff back. And I'll show you some of the examples of what you can get back, but there's a lot of interesting things that come out of the router. You have to be authenticated. The third one is there's an unauthenticated endpoint. If you want to go and start attacking your users, and you want to see who has a router, who doesn't, that's the endpoint you would use. You could choose, once you know what the local network looks like, you call that endpoint, and as a matter of fact, the official ASUS application that they have for Android does the same thing. And then you can actually detect whether somebody's running or not running an ASUS router. And then the vulnerabilities are listed in order of the CVE numbers, not in order of severity. The last one is the Wi-Fi password disclosure. There's an endpoint in the router that will give you the Wi-Fi password. Now, in this point, ASUS chose to actually make it a little more secure. That is an XML endpoint, not a JSON-P endpoint. So web security in browsers at this point kicks in. And you can't actually do this. But if you manage to somehow cross the network boundary, if you're on the user's local network, you get their Wi-Fi passwords. Now, these are the actual CVEs. What do we do with them? How do we put them together? So, first of all, just to review about CSRF, unless you're using a very modern browser, which is the latest version of Chrome, and using something called same site, which is very, very new, every time you do a request to a site, a cookie gets sent back, and that will establish state. So that will happen is anybody can sort of write in that session. The proper way to get around those issues is that for those who work in application security, we have CSRF tokens, which are tokens that are generated every single time something comes back from the server, and we have to send them that second token back. That is not what is happening in the ASUS router. JSON-P is the other one. JSON-P is a way to bypass basically every browser restriction there is. JSON-P originally was invented as a way to, when the beginnings of security in web browsers were put in, that's what happened was people suddenly figured out we cannot load data from other sites through XML HTTP request. How do we do this? So they came up with JSON-P, which is not really a standard, it's a convention, but essentially is you could do a script include, and you tell the server, here's the callback function I want. So you could do script include and say callback. It will give you back a piece of JavaScript, write the data in that callback, and execute it within the context of your machine. Now, what will happen is, let's say if you have Bank of America, and Bank of America does this, so they have a JSON-P endpoint, then any other website can just go and do bankofamerica.com/JSON-P and get whatever data they're sending back. In application security world, this is very, very bad. The funny thing is, if they were not using JSON-P, if they're using XML HTTP request, which is what most sites are using, then web security in the browser kicks in automatically. You wouldn't have this issue. So somebody went out of the way and actually put in the JSON-P. This is the exploit chain. Now, if you notice, the exploit chain is very different than network level. Network level exploit chain starts with scanning. There's no scanning here. The first problem is that we cannot actually get to the UI of the router because it's running internally. It's running within the local network. It should not be accessible from the outside. The way you would need to do that, you need to get somebody who is on that network to visit a malicious page. You could do a watering hole. You could do spam. You could do a fake app. Whatever it is, you have to get somebody to actually click on that link and hit that site. It will not work otherwise. But once you do that, then the next step is, let's say you did manage to phish someone, or you did manage to do whatever it is, and now they are on your site. Then what we do is the second step is there's that endpoint. The third step. The second step is you have to find out what the IP range is. Now, most modern browsers support the protocol called WebRTC, which is used for essentially video chatting, Skyping and stuff like that. WebRTC's got a bunch of security holes. You can go, I think there was a black hat presentation a couple of years back. Essentially, you could tell your browser and ask it, what is your local range? And it will tell you what the local LAN range is. Now, at that point, so let's say you know the local range. Most routers will sit as the first one. So it says 192.168.99. It will be probably 99.1. That's when you get to the third step is, again, the user is still on that site. They hit that site. The site runs the JavaScript to do WebRTC. The next point is it runs the third step, which is it calls the JSON-P endpoint and says, are you alive? If it gets a response back, that's an ASUS router. Now you are at step 4. Now, this may sound like, this never happens, right? No, everybody changes their credentials. If you look at the studies that have been done, most users do not bother to change their credentials for the router because the router is inside a firewall. So what happens is the ASUS routers come with default credentials. I think it's admin password or admin. That's when the next vulnerability comes in. So the CSRF attack. So again, we're dealing with several different steps. I'm going to go through all of them. But the CSRF attack then lets you log into the router. Number 5, you can use additional endpoints to collect information on the router. And number 6 is when you can actually use the same CSRF vulnerability to do whatever you want. In my example, you turn on remote access. You put on a high port. You could also, for example, number 7, ASUS routers have ability to send logs remotely. You could do that also. But at that point, every setting within the router can be changed. And what's interesting there is the user has to be visiting a malicious site in the same, they don't have to be logged into the router. The site can do it all for them. It doesn't take very long. It takes maybe 30 seconds. And then it's done. Now, the first step is obviously the hardest. This is why this attack is not rated higher, because this is not the kind of thing that you can write a worm for. This is the kind of thing you can just scan all IPs. You have to actually trick someone to visit a site. And there are many ways to do that. You could phishing, spam, watering holes, whatever it is, you have to actually do that first step. Now, a conventional phishing attack asks you, when you click a site, it asks you for username and password, say a fake Gmail site. A lot of the detection mechanisms around phishing will look for that. This does not. All this needs to do is you visit any site, because the user will not see the JavaScript commands that are happening behind the scenes. So what they do is, at this point, you get them somehow to visit a malicious site. Now, at that point, using WebRTC, and that's the link to one of the security issues, Flash is another way for it to leak. You could also assume that .1.0, .1.1 is probably default. If you're using a mobile app, that may work also. My router, the one that I worked on, doesn't have the last issue, but some routers actually do. Because they control the DNS, they have the default domains defined, they will always go to the router. So you could check whether the domain is there, and then access the endpoint, and at that point you'll see whether it's an ASUS router or not an ASUS router. But the third step is, so now they visited the page, you found out what their IP address was, or you hit one of those domains. That is the endpoint that you need to hit. If you hit that endpoint on IP, it will give you that information. The information is very basic. From a security angle, it sounds pretty innocent. All it's going to tell you is what is the model, what is the SSID of the network, and what's the IP address of it. The second one is even smaller. But by itself, this is the one that I'm still arguing with ASUS about. They haven't fixed it because they don't consider this to be an issue. I consider this to be an issue because it's another way in, further in. Like, for example, the model number. Some of the ASUS models have patches, some of them do not. If I know what the model number of your router is, then I can target specific attacks to that model. I think they are convinced at this point that this is an issue, but they haven't fixed it yet. So you have your website, you call in these two endpoints, you get some data back. Now you know the user is running an ASUS router. This is an example of an actual code that will do that. I have this code in my blog. This is a very, very basic way of doing it, obviously more sophisticated way of doing it, but this is how you would do this in JavaScript. You append a child element with a script include. You call whatever that endpoint is. Either it will come back with an error or it will come back with the data you're looking for. Next step is the actual login. The default login for the router is admin. It needs to be base64 encoded. Very simple example, just a form. You find a form, you do a form.submit. Either you're in or you're not in, and the way you verify that is the next step. But essentially, this relies on the fact that the user will not change their credentials, which is true in most cases. However, I do want to point out in this step, if they did change their credentials, there's not much you can do. So it does rely, there's multiple steps here that need to happen. But based on what I've seen out there and the surveys that were done, most users do not change their credentials. If they did change their credentials, then you have to go with your conventional phishing or something similar. So at this point, you know their router IP, you know it's running an ASUS, you know which model of ASUS it's running, and you're able to log into the interface. Now, you can collect additional information here if you want. The CV that I highlighted on top, which is the XML one, is not accessible from the web. But if you make a fake mobile application or a desktop application, you could access it. That gives you the Wi-Fi password. I don't know how valuable the Wi-Fi password would be or not, because if you're local to the network, it may be valuable. If you're not local to it, then the password has to be reusable somewhere else. I don't know how true that is. The second one is 5892, There's a second set of JSON endpoints. So in one of the previous steps I highlighted, again, JSON-P can be done cross-domain. This is the second one that lets you log in additional information. You could get information about the router, about things that are attached to it. Here's some examples. Information about what the WAN link looks like. You could get the next two are pretty interesting. That does an active scan around all the surrounding access points. It takes some time. It actually puts load on the router. You could potentially DOS the router that way. The next one gives you information about the local network. You get origin information. There's information about the external IP. The last one can open WebDev access to the router. The WebDev access is routed through another server. So all of these things are interesting, but I don't know how much you can do with them. They're interesting. Here's an example of getting the external IP address. Now, why is the external IP address important? Maybe they open the external access on the router, maybe not. Most ASUS routers do not have that open. But this is an example of what you can collect. Again, very simplistic. This is no libraries, nothing. This is HTML 101. There's nothing complicated here or how you actually get the information into the browser. This is where everything comes together. So at this point, you have tricked a user on the same network into visiting a malicious page. Not a phishing page, just a malicious page. The page used WebRTC to find out the local IP range. We did a JSON-P call to figure out it's an ASUS router. We did CSRF to log in. You could do whatever you want, because every setting in the browser can be changed through CSRF. The same way that there's CSRF on login, the state of your login to the router is there. So for example, if a user is logged in and you don't know their credentials, you could do this also, but it's easier to just try to log in. And you could do all of these various things. So what I would do is, I would open remote access. I would limit the remote access to a high port, so Shodan doesn't find it. And I would also limit the remote access to the IP range that I want, so I can get in and nobody else can get in. If you want to do, you could change username and password. I would not recommend. This is not something that an attacker probably would do if they were smart, because a user may figure out something's wrong. But then again, how often does somebody log into the router? So of all of the vulnerabilities of those four, this is the one that's the most severe, because this one actually lets you change the settings on the router. But to exploit this successfully, it's not something you can do from outside. You have to actually be, user has to be on a local network, and they have to be able to hit a page you're giving them. I haven't tried whether Outlook or something that's web-based but not browser-based can do this. I don't think it can, because JavaScript is limited. So you got to get them to visit that page. Now, this is the administrative UI for the ASUS router. Those are all the various options. This is just a few of them, but there's way, way more of them in there. And basically, this is how you would actually turn on remote access. Again, it's very simple. It's a web form. You have to be able to. You have to be logged in from one of the previous steps. Well, once you're logged in, basically this is what you do. This code is incomplete on purpose, but anybody who digs into the UI can figure it out. I have not been able to consistently reproduce it on my router 100% of the time. It only works sometimes. I suspect there's a timeout of some sort in there. Other people have reproduced it successfully and left comments on the blog and saying that other models don't have the timeout. But again, this is a very simple attack. CSRF, form.submit, and that's it. You're in there. Here's another example in the UI also. Let's say you do not want to do that, but you want to see what the person is doing on the router on the network level. There is a remote logging server there. I don't know how detailed it goes. I don't know whether it goes into actual network level, but that's another example. You do a CSRF attack, same way, and you go and change the settings, and then the user doesn't know anything. They're not going to know what's going to happen. So what's the worst thing you can do? You can have administrative access to the router. Now, one thing also that's interesting, which is the last point, yeah, you can mess with the router, you can mess with the network speeds, you could get administrative access. You could also update the firmware. The user's not going to know anything at that point. I mean, that's also something that can be done through CSRF as well. At that point, it may become somewhat wormable. But again, if there's a worm that's spreading, it has to get to the other users. And with application level attacks, it's kind of hard to do that. But yeah, if you have administrative access to the router, you could update the firmware. There's at least 2 open source ones that are out there. It's trivial to download them and modify them. So that's basically, just to go back to the exploit chain, is you get them to visit the malicious page, detect the IP range through WebRTC, figure out if step 3, if they have an ASUS router, log in through CSRF. Number 5, you could collect the data if you want to. It might not be helpful to anyone. You could choose not to. Number 6, you do remote access or change the settings or firmware, whatever it is that you want to do actual malicious activity, and then you're basically done. Now, one last thing also. Now, I mentioned that this is all about application security. However, one more thing. After I found mine, somebody actually found a bunch of network level ones. So just what I focused on was application security. However, there are other attacks in the firmware that are also network-based. There's very little information available about these 2 CVEs. The only thing that's available is that ASUS has not fixed them. And it's unclear whether it could be remotely exploitable or locally exploitable, but that's where you basically get back into NetSec territory. Now, what I learned from this is that manufacturers of routers don't necessarily know much about security. Now, we would hope they know something about network security, but what I found is that application security often is even worse. It's also important to know what kind of router you have. Now, the router that I've used, the ASUS router, when I was doing this work, which was last December, they haven't had any security patches, I think, for 2 years at that point. Since they released this patch, which was back in March, there's no more patches since then. So I would not necessarily recommend, when you're buying a router, make sure you know what you're buying and make sure it's updated. The other option you could do is go with open source firmware. Open source firmware like OpenWRT, Merlin, they maintain their stuff better. But again, the vulnerabilities that I'm discussing here, unfortunately, are in both because I haven't necessarily seen the open source ones fix them before the manufacturer does. Admin credentials need to be changed, and that's an important point. We think that the network boundary cannot be breached easily. In this case, a CSRF attack or JSON-P attack is something that a lot of people who operate on a network layer don't necessarily realize. And a lot of people who even do applications don't necessarily realize. The router is a box, but it's got a UI. If it's got a UI, then it's got an application. If it's got an application, it might be vulnerable. CSRF, JSON-P, those kind of things can cross from one side to another. It can bypass browser security. Another thing that I do recommend if you want to deal with your browser or with your router, which is this is something that I do for my own routers. I do not administer them when I'm logged into somewhere else. I go into anonymous mode into somewhere else, and I log out when I'm done. Why? Because these kind of attacks that I'm describing can be done without you knowing. You will not know anything. You could be logged into your router, and you could be visiting some site, and you may not realize there is a piece of advertising code that brings in a piece of JavaScript, and then that piece of JavaScript starts talking to your router. Because these type of attacks, CSRF and JSON-P, can cross from site to site without anybody knowing anything. Last piece also is that when I was originally trying to find information about the ASUS security team, there's a lot of interesting stuff out there, and none of it was from ASUS. And part of the problem also is ASUS has multiple country sites. So some of the attacks here, especially on the mobile side, which I didn't dig into a lot, but if you have an ASUS app, you better make sure it actually comes from ASUS. Same thing for that stuff. If you want to make sure it's an ASUS website, you got to make sure it's coming from ASUS. Especially since one of the things that I've seen is some of the domain name stuff. Those domain names that ASUS has registered are not actually registered publicly, and someone can register them publicly and grab them. So there's a lot of sort of things to keep in mind when you have a router. Everything I have here is on that blog post. All of these CVEs have been reported. As I said, 3 out of 4 have been fixed. If you have any questions, feel free to reach out. Any questions? Thank you.